here we are. I'm excited about today. I'm really enjoying this series, as I wrote. Okay, so I've given overviews of a lot of the layers that we need. So in one way of imagining how we're going to continue is it's maybe a little bit like coats of paint, right? Where you're kind of make a few coats. But we need to, I've kind of given an overview, but I need to make sure that we, the main focus today, or the main bottleneck I want to make sure I break with you guys is that we totally understand the nature of the universe in essence, and why it is that the universe can't do anything in and of itself, where it's not foundational in terms of a cause. We can understand without talking about this type of thing, we can understand and pretty much know that God exists, but it's still confusing if someone says, well, why can't the universe do it? Like do this or that. You can sort of understand yourself, like sort of why that's not the case, or why it can't, without really understanding what the universe is like made up of, and how causation really works most fundamentally. But you end up, you still have an argument based on cause and how contingent things need a cause, things that could be otherwise, things that are not like self-existent. And there has to be, like earlier in my life, I could explain how there has to be exactly one self-existent thing in existence, and that would have to create other things that were not self-existent. I like explaining it this way primarily instead. And by this way, I mean where we really understand what the universe is made up of, and I'm going to start here with our interaction with observing what we think of as reality or the universe, and such. Kind of the interplay between like our self interacting with and observing the world. There are three views. The last one isn't really a view people take seriously, so there's really just two. And then the first one is also not a view that like it's well known among philosophers and psychologists, that the first one, naive realism, is while it's totally how we think about the world without thinking about it, no one who thinks about it or studies it or whatever thinks that it's the case. It's obviously false, even to normal philosophers, who are not me and you guys. They even understand how naive realism is obviously false. So then representational realism, I haven't said what these things are yet, but I'm just starting somewhere. Representational realism is then pretty much where people arrive at when they think about things, but they have a sense that it isn't right either, and then we can have an even clearer sense that it can't be the answer. So you basically have sort of like three possible answers. Perceptualism is sort of like that our mind creates the world in essence, and then it's mostly just an idea that like kind of one guy kind of came up with, and I forget the guy's name, and then it's kind of covered in the philosophy of like perception and in this topic when you study philosophy. But no, people don't really take it seriously, but it's kind of interesting in contrast. It helps us to kind of understand what representational realism refers to kind of better. So it kind of provides a contrast. Naive realism is like what you see is what you get. It's just how our brains process things kind of by default is like what you see is all there is. When you look at a tree or a computer or whatever, when you have a memory, you're remembering, kind of things as they were. The memory's accurate. But particularly when you're observing the world, you're kind of seeing things as they are. And this is how we normally function. And it works a lot of the time, right? That the sidewalk is as it appears to be, basically. And if it doesn't, it's kind of like within naive, like optical illusions and things like that, or just misseeing something, or thinking that the sidewalk is solid, but someone laid a trap and they kind of disguised the sidewalk or a piece of grass with a trap, right? Like in the woods, you might imagine like a trap that someone sets where there's like a camouflage over the trap and there's like a pit trap or something like that. That's all within naive realism. It's like, oh, I thought it was solid ground, but actually someone laid a trap. I didn't see it as it was, but I was fooled. But that whole type of thinking is still naive realism. Just because someone's like kind of just like camouflage something, or if there's like a mirage in the desert where it looks like an oasis or something, but it's not really there. That still kind of, or optical illusions that you can draw, right? That still kind of falls within, naive realism, except that there's a little trick, or something like that. Representational realism is the closest to what makes sense, but it's fundamentally flawed. And the reason why we have kind of three possibilities, all of which are flawed, is because deeper than that, people misunderstand the nature of the universe and reality, and what we're the nature of ourselves, and how we interact with reality, how we observe and affect reality, and so forth. As we understand this, or as we understand this better, or when you understood this, if you heard me explain this in the past, other philosophers and people are basically like in kindergarten or pre-K when it comes to understanding like life, the universe, and everything, the nature of the universe and our interaction with it. They're not really at square one with it. And so there's a kind of side but massive benefit to that. Now, absolutely, we never ever want to think that we're overall better or smarter, not morally better, nor status-wise better, nor in general smarter than other people. We should have a red flag for that in our mind, and never what's the word? I'm thinking ascribe, and that's wrong. Aspire. Never aspire to that. Whenever we spot that in our minds or hearts or whatever, then we want to do our best to fix that. However, regarding a particular topic, we can understand that someone doesn't know what they're talking about, and that we do sometimes. Now, we might be wrong about that, like in some cases. Of course, people can be arrogant and think they know something they don't. But in this case, we can think we know it and be correct. And there's a benefit. If I go down here, is this now? I wrote here, what's on this slide? Okay, that's what existence is composed of. That's what I'll get to. I wrote this, like, what is the benefit of a great paradigm shift regarding who your peers are? And I'm just referring to something here in my other webinars and other series where I'm overall talking about law of implication and success and goals and so forth. And then I'll also in the future be doing a specific kind of subtopic series on goals that I'm looking forward to as well, where I'll talk about this and more. But I've said in the past, but something very critical and profound to our practical interaction with the world in terms of striving and goals, and that kind of organizes our life, right? Our goals. It has to do with everything we want and so forth. And then I'm just going to refer to this. I'm not going to get into this here. But our mind automatically calculates our standards and norms for ourselves, like what we think we should do, what we should accomplish, what we should avoid doing, and so forth. Whether it's particular tasks or achievements in life, whether it's on a kind of a moral level, or kind of how we should treat our friends, whatever, how much money we should make, how good shape we should be in physically, all that stuff. So our mind automatically calculates our standards and norms. This kind of happens behind the scenes, but affects you massively, based on its calculation of how your peers are doing. So it has to go out and figure out or decide or calculate what it thinks are your peers. It does all this kind of invisibly. So, okay, here's the peers of you regarding a particular area of life, like your financially or other ways. And then like if all your peers were giving a bunch of money to a cause, then it might feel more normal and like a standard that you might want to live up to, right? To give money to that cause, right? You at least have, like kind of feel a certain tug in that way, right? So again, that's kind of how your mind calculates standards and norms, right? How the amount of money people were making in the general like financial class they appeared to be in. I don't think financial classes are real, but of course there's a basic reality to them or whatever. There's a perception to them. So your mind's going to say, all right, well, that's my peers probably, unless there's kind of something that shifts that. And then you're going to feel like that's about how much money you should make. Or maybe that you feel like you want to do better than them, who knows? And then goals, your individual goals that drive kind of your behavior and wants and needs and feeling good and all that stuff are derived from the standards and norms. So what's interesting here as we take a look at how we observe nature of reality and what underlies that and the nature of the universe, causation, and understanding about God, is that it can, as we lay this foundation and cover these topics that are critical for it, it can actually kind of automatically cause a shift in who you view as a peer. It's not about being better than anyone else. I can't stress that enough. But this underlies people's judgments about what you should focus on in life, what you should accomplish in life, what's moral to do or not do, and so forth. And so if they just they're not even at square one with understanding the nature of reality and understanding the nature of our interaction with reality, our discovery of reality, or thinking about reality, all that stuff. If you know that people are not at square one with that, then it naturally would make you feel like, if your mind looks around, it's like, oh, there aren't really peers for me, then you naturally will feel more like free and thinking for yourself. And we all tend to aspire to this idea of not really caring what other people think. That's not really possible, like directly. However, you can clear out a lot of the unuseful kind of. You also don't really want your mind to just do all this invisibly and think that it's real and right. This thing where the mind goes and figures out who your peers are, but not based on what's true, just kind of based on its own ways that it operates kind of automatically, right? And then comes up with, okay, let's make sure we do about as well as they do, or something like that. And all that. You don't want that to just be happening outside of your awareness in this way that feels so strong. And this helps you kind of decouple, in a sense, from that. So that's kind of a side benefit here. All right, because it's a little bit like deep, and so I wanted to kind of point out even additional practical benefits. Deep is very useful, right? I talk about foundationalism. You're getting underneath things, and so instead of struggling and trying to solve problems at the level of thinking that created them, including just for your own life, or solving puzzles at the level of thinking that created them, like this issue between naive realism, representational realism, and perceptualism, or just how do we interact with and observe reality, is unresolvable at the level of thinking that kind of came up with these terms and these theories or questions about this topic. So we can only resolve it by getting underneath it. So, but first on this slide, I want to give you a sense of the alternatives and how they're kind of all wrong, which again would mean that there's some deeper assumption that's off. So naive realism is really something you just need to realize what it refers to, and then why it makes sense, or how it's the case that your mind just kind of thinks this way or operates this way by default, but it's not really. It's something that's obviously wrong once we just reflect on it a little bit. But that's sort of it relates to I don't know if it's a parallel thing or an example, but how I talk about how matter seems solid, right? That's like naive realism, but then we, upon just reflection or a little bit of knowledge about basic science, we understand that it's mostly empty space on a molecular level. So that's just a quick kind of example of how we know that naive realism is wrong when we stop and compare it with other stuff that we know. But yet in your day-to-day life, you're going to pretty much operate based on it. And it's okay to operate based on it, just like it's okay to get into a movie or a game or a book that you're reading, right? It's okay to read the Lord of the Rings trilogy and feel like that's real, that Gandalf is real, the Sauron is real, and the problem is real, and that, you know, you kind of, that way you feel it, it's interesting. You can quickly understand what you're reading because you're kind of immersed in it, and your mind is good when you get immersed in something. Immersion goes along with a sense of, like, your mind is a big part of what it does is actually fabricate a feeling of reality. It's doing that with what people think of as real reality, because they don't really ever get to step outside of real reality. They can step sort of inside of it, like when they watch a movie or read a book or something. But when you do that, we can call it escapism, but you're not really stepping outside of reality. You're more like going into like a sub version, you know, thing in reality, like a subset, or, you know, or whatever that is, that, you know, is kind of fantasy or made up. um, but that doesn't take you, it feels like it takes you out of your day-to-day life in a certain sense, but you still, right, you have to step outside kind of in the different direction in order to really, as we'll try to do conceptually here, to really understand that what we think of as reality in real life is weirdly similar to like a movie or a book, where it's not as real as it seems. Unlike a book or a movie, again, it's more like if you were tied to a virtual reality set that also could stimulate your pain and pleasure, both physically and emotions and so forth, right? So life is very real in sense of, like, suffering is real, joy, goodness is real, right? And so none of what I'm talking about reality should minimize how much we care about others or care about their suffering or care about them having more goodness and that sort of thing. It should even actually make it more of that being the case, because we'll can always look at people ultimately as beings that we care about, even as like when we can have a view of reality where we never see them as objects. We can see their self, their mind, their body as an object that might even in extreme cases need to be stopped, even by killing them. But where we don't mix that up with fundamentally them as a being. We don't ever want a being to suffer. We might need someone's mind or body to be stopped in an extreme case. All right. So I was describing naive realism, right, which is a little bit like what you see is what you get. That a chair really is hard. It really is brown if it's brown, or, you know, couch is like brown and soft or whatever. That it looks the way it looks, you know, to like, and you kind of, oh, and along with this, our minds tend to assume by default that other people's minds are kind of seeing and feeling and coming from the same place that we are. When children are very young, they fully think that. As people grow older, they still have the reflex for feeling and thinking that you can do this. You could prove this to like eye tracking exercise, where you can do experiments where adults will compensate for realizing what something looks like from a different person's point of view, but their eyes will kind of first go like instinctively towards what it's like from their own point of view, you know, and then they can kind of compensate in a lot of cases. Okay, wait, it's different for this person. There's a pretty interesting book called Mindwise, Mindwise, which could, it kind of deals with topics like this. Not this what's on the slide, but other people's minds and kind of a theory of mind that way, and how people do and don't adjust for other people's minds or kind of read other people's minds, and, like, you know, how well you really know the mind of your spouse, your friends, and or your coworkers or boss, that sort of thing. Okay, so I was saying part of naive realism is this idea that other people are experiencing the same thing you are. This comes up in conversations with people where we'll have kind of a mental picture in mind and we'll be talking about it, kind of as if we're looking at a painting and talking based on the painting. Like, oh, I wonder why the house looks the way that it does in that painting. But if the other person's not looking at that same painting, then they can't really follow what we're saying very well. And then but I'm being metaphorical here, right? But people will be talking to someone else. They'll often get impatient that someone doesn't understand what they're explaining readily and so forth. Or they'll just talk in a way where people kind of check out and their mind will wander because they're talking as if the other person has similar mental picture, like in their mind, similar context. So naive realism is constantly the default of the way that our mind kind of thinks. We don't want to necessarily aspire to not having that be the default. What we want to aspire is to have like red flags in our mind whenever, like kind of constantly, whenever this is going to be relevant. Mostly this has to do with judging other people, explaining things to other people, being impatient with other people, which is a form of judging them, motivating other people, convincing other people, right? With all these things, we need to realize that we're going to constantly, it's like an anchor. Our own view of things is like an anchor point, and we like kind of try to compensate and move from the anchor to imagine what someone else might be thinking or what might convince them or motivate them. But typically we only move about like part way because we're still starting like where we are, and we usually don't move far enough or do enough to try to get a sense of where they're at. Sort of like on these webinars when I just talk and don't look at the comments. Yeah. So we just want to understand that, that's the case. And the more important the situation is where it's going to matter, the difference, then the more we want to compensate for it and realize that we're not going to probably naturally compensate enough. So we need to try to compensate even more than normal, than like might feel normal or default. Regarding this topic of understanding God exists and the nature of reality and such, we right now just want to realize that point one is this is how we kind of feel about the world naturally and by default, and two, it's obviously false. But we also want to feel how it's useful, and not that we're wrong or stupid or that our minds are designed wrong for doing this by default, right? It's a great shortcut. Our minds have to shortcut nonstop because there's just so much information that our minds are trying to process, because our minds are, first of all, getting a ton of just external inputs all the time, and then it needs to be processed, and conclusions need to come up, it needs to be applied to our goals, and well, and then projecting the future and what's going to be useful to do, what should we say, it all happens so fast. So our minds have to have all sorts of shortcuts nonstop. Ideally, we want to have a sense of those shortcuts and have red flags to stop, and when those shortcuts are going to be counterproductive instead of productive. But it isn't that we just want to say, oh no, I'm done with shortcuts. My mind doesn't do shortcuts because I learned about this or that or whatever, that David talks about, or from the various books on psychology, and my mind no longer does that. No, you don't want to. That's a trap. We want to embrace that our mind uses shortcuts, understand, accept it, but then again have red flags to stop, and have it not use those shortcuts or compensate or use the shortcuts at least less when it particularly matters, when those are going to lead us astray. So that's naive realism. Representational realism is if we are in high school and we're learning about optics, or college maybe learning about optics, right? We might see, I don't have one pulled up, but we might see like how they like a diagram where the brain, it'll say, makes an image, right, between the light hitting our retina, a chemical reaction there, and then that goes into nerves where you're getting like electrical impulses and such, which is then kind of translated, and there's kind of like a backwards image that's reversed, and there's two eyes, which helps with depth perception, and then the mind takes the two images and turns it into one kind of 3D image, and it also actually cleans up a lot of the picture. It's like our mind kind of photoshops. If you were to have a device that could kind of recreate what's really kind of coming into your eyes from the kind of light waves and so forth, that what the image kind of should be, it would be much more, it'd be like a TV set that was like grainy or had bad reception. So our mind actually emphasizes edges and corners and highlight, like kind of makes things look more crisp and clear than even the light waves or the image would be if it was just direct, as I understand it. That's kind of a little bit besides the point, but it just kind of helps kind of fill in a picture of what's going on. All right. So the idea, separate from the science or whatever of it, the idea, I just kind of again went into that a little bit of context to kind of picture what I'm talking about. The idea is that our mind creates a visual. Let's just start with visual. We can talk about other senses in a moment, but it's kind of the same metaphorically in parallel. Our mind, within vision, for example, creates like a visual image of the world, right? And so when people start thinking about it, they say, okay, sure, I see a visual image of the world. I see an image of the tree, a visual image that my eyes and mind and brain and stuff create of the tree. So yeah, I'm not like seeing the tree as it is in this one sense, but I'm seeing an image of the tree that I can treat like as a tree, right? Color is something that is in the visual image. It's not really in the tree, but the kind of precursor for the color, where there's atoms and electrons and shells and photons being emitted as electrons change shells and such, orbitals and such. Then or photons from other places getting absorbed by molecules, and then we reflected, and then we kind of see what's not absorbed, things like that. So that's what people think of as, okay, that's what's out there, is the photons and being absorbed or being emitted and being reflected, and then color is in the visual image. So why can't that be right? We don't necessarily, like, it's a useful question. Whether or not we fully kind of get it or not, it's just a matter of maybe over time you can get it more and more. Maybe what I'll say on this webinar will particularly help. And regardless, we'll be able to see, as we see the right answer, everything will kind of fit and make sense, and it won't be confusing like this. So David, why can't we be seeing a visual image of the universe? So why can't we have, what's wrong with our standard understanding of the world, where there's a universe out there that's basically exists as we see it? In essence, people's real normal view of the world is sort of an odd blend of naive realism and representational realism. Right? Again, perceptualism is like our mind just sort of fully creates reality itself. The argument for perceptualism is sort of like, well, it can't be, the first two can't be right, so maybe that only leaves the third. But that's not the case. The real answer is kind of different than all of them, but you need to have a different assumption, or not assumption, but different correct premise about a realization, discovery about how the nature kind of the universe and our interaction with it. So David, why can't, as I was saying, why can't there be a world out there, and then we see an image of it, we feel the feeling of it, we hear the sounds of it, right, and so forth? Well, when we try to ask certain questions based on that view, that kind of hodgepodge mixture of naive realism and representational realism, or it's like an attempt to fix naive realism by saying, okay, sure, well, we don't really see what's exactly there, we see an image of it. But then we just kind of say that the image is pretty much the same as what's out there, and so what's the difference? Would people basically travel back to naive realism? First of all, if all we see are images, then we actually have no sense, literally, any of the senses of the external world. We're just seeing images, right? Like if all you interact with is ambassadors of a particular country, you've never seen that country. To say, well, maybe I have seen the country, but all you've done is talk to ambassadors and hear their descriptions of it or whatever, then you still haven't, observed the country itself. And you really have no idea. The country doesn't even necessarily exist, right? You could have people just making it up. with the universe, something exists because of the consistency of our experience, right? There's a continuity to our experience, and we have expectations, and they keep getting met within reason. Even if we get surprised here and there, even if we fall in a pit trap where someone disguised it, or we trip on the sidewalk or whatever, and we didn't expect to, the basic nature of the world just keeps on being roughly like what we expect, like plenty, as opposed to it being just totally chaotic and there being like no connection between one moment and the next, or what we think we see. If we're just like bump into objects all the time that we don't even see, and then we see other objects and we walk through them, that would be what it'd be like if there was like kind of no correlation between our representation of the world and our expectations of the world, and then the world or whatever was out there. So because of the great overlap between our perception and the representations of the world and our expectations, and how it just seems to conform pretty well, then that kind of reinforces our sense of this kind of hodgepodge or blurry conflation of naive realism and representational realism. One of the major threads that I pulled in order to get out of this, because when you try to look at it directly, you're just kind of confusing. You're like, well, if I keep trying to explain why it's wrong, it's just going to be a little, again, confusing. Instead, we need to look at an anomaly, and I can at least tell you I pulled on it, and then see what's right, and then we can compare. So what I would do, one example that I in real life in the past actually thought about was like, all right, how about let's just take like the street, right? Like the street you drive on. If I were to ask myself or another person, is the street gray? And then if I were to also ask them, is the street hard, or will the street hold up my car, or does the street continue past what I can see? What we're going to find is, if we were to write those questions down and then write an answer to those questions, this is pretty fascinating. Or at least to me, if we say, is the street gray, and we say yes, or we say gray with yellow lines, and double yellow line and some white dashed lines, then we must be referring to the street as our image of the street, because the gray and the yellow lines and so forth only exist in our visual image of the street. We know, just kind of scientifically, like I pointed out, that the color doesn't exist out there. So we're referring to our image. But then we can ask other questions that can only be answered in reference to this idea of a real street out there external to my image, right? Like the image isn't hard. The idea is that out there it's hard, right? It really will hold up my car as I drive on it. And does it continue past what I can see? Obviously, I must be referring to some external street that's not my image or representation of the street, because obviously my image or representation doesn't continue past where I can see, not at least the visual image. There could be like a conceptual idea of the street that can continue in a sense, but then even then it's like a concept. So we wouldn't say that continues. The concept just sort of exists as a concept. So you see, we can do this, and you can do this with kind of any object or anything really, that where you're comparing or creating this thing where you can ask questions where it's mutually exclusive, where you could answer these questions about the street or a tree or yourself or another person or your computer, and you can make it so that the answers to your questions about the properties of that thing or object or whatever are mutually exclusive. Your answers can only in some cases be true if the thing is a representation, and they can only be true in other cases if the thing was sort of real in this way that we imagine. It's just out there existing, doing stuff, holding objects up and that sort of thing out there in the universe and the world in reality. And again, mutually exclusive. So our beliefs about the road, the street, right, and everything else is that it's both, and it's sometimes only an image, and other times only a thing out there, and also both, right? So it's one and not the other, it's the other and not the one, or it's both mixed together, and so that can't be right. And so that meant our basic understanding of reality and our interaction and observation of it had to be wrong or flawed in some way. And this is when people basically just give up, or they start trying to sound smart by no longer examining the foundations, but instead talking in ways that seem interesting and clever without questioning the foundation. When you realize people do this, it's kind of fascinating. When we examine evolution at some point fairly soon in webinars, where I'll do a topic on that, like a topic series or whatever, we can see that where scientists, or whoever you call them, people, they don't examine the theory, they just kind of assert it all the time. And they come up with all these clever details and scientific experiments or theories and like sub-theories and about how this organism or organ got made, or this DNA sequence or whatever. So they can think and theorize and write papers and do all kinds of stuff without ever examining their flawed premise, so that they still can come up with like an unlimited amount of academic papers and material and thoughts and things. So they can kind of think infinitely and discuss infinitely and publish infinitely without realizing error, which is a surprising thing about the world, but it's how it is. And that's how it is with people's basic observation and understanding of the world, is people think and do all kinds of stuff every day and make money and feed themselves and invent stuff and make stuff and whatever, and they never really realize that their basic understanding of how they even go about understanding reality and observing reality and what reality is wrong. And again, in practice, it's kind of a hodgepodge of naive realism and representational realism, none of which makes sense. Okay. So here's the answer, and then we kind of have to bridge the gap in our understanding and make sure we see why it's the answer and so forth. I'll do the best I can with that. As we get this, it's much easier to not get confused with the basic idea that contingent things can't exist in and of themselves. You can't have a whole universe of stuff that can't exist on its own, that had to be like made in some way, that's contingent. Stuff with a cause, right, an effect. You can't have a whole universe of effects. You can't have a whole existence of nothing but effects. You need to have something that exists that's not an effect, that's also capable of creating effects. That was my kind of previous proof or explanation of how we can know that God exists, right? And it's correct, but people can still get confused in this morass of some form of, well, why can't the universe do it still? Why can't the universe be the thing that's self-existent? Why can't the universe be self-existent? Which is nonsense from so many angles. Because again, what is the universe? Like, so what's also extraordinary about this previous slide, about this blend of naive realism and representational realism, and how people's words, concepts, their idea of things and what they are, there's two different mutually exclusive meanings of things, and in essence definitions, but not in the sense of a word. Like definitions in people's understanding is like a string of words, right? Like if you look it up in a dictionary, there's going to be a phrase that's like a definition of a word. But the meanings, the underlying meaning that people have for all sorts of words and concepts is this weird, blurry, inherent double meaning. So there's this crazy blurriness that's unresolvable at the level of thinking that created the blurriness with the meanings of everyone's words. Is they both mean a sort of representation or image of that thing or even the concept, and then there's like the underlying reality of the concept or the external reality or underlying reality. And like I try to illustrate with the questions about the street, if you look at it carefully, they're mutually exclusive, and they like a thing like the street, someone could propose, well, David, maybe they do have a clear meaning. The clear meaning is like both the representation and the reality kind of combined, or it's the underlying reality and the representation is just a representation. But if you look closely at these questions that I listed and the answers, the people would say the street is gray. Not that my visual representation of the street is gray, but that the street is gray. And it's not just semantics, it's inherent to people's understanding of things. It's like if you start talking about God and this topic of proving it and stuff, then one thing that's very common for people to say is, well, it depends on your definition of God. Well, that type of statement is based on this experience of reality where people can't think, where all their concepts are inherently blurry, so that people just kind of take for granted that things are all blurry. It's like, well, depends how you define God. No, that's entirely incorrect. It doesn't depend how you define God. Everything about that statement is, or it depends how you define any statement that's like depends how you define X, is based on this misunderstanding of the world and the nature of reality, but also the nature of our mental objects, our ability to think about and define mental objects. And so there's this inherent blurriness, this inherent double meaning for like everyone's concepts and words. And so people can't think. Again, they're not peers. They're like in pre-K when it comes to thinking. And it's kind of then bizarre because people are also so arrogant about thinking, right? You could think about this stuff and put 1,000 hours into it or 10,000 hours. And you'll come across a person who's put 0 hours. And they'll be dead sure that they're infinitely better than you at thinking, right? Because the minute they disagree, they will be sure that you're wrong and they're right. Imagine someone puts 10,000 hours into something, you put 0, or not you, but another person puts 0, and they're dead sure that they're better than the person that put 10,000. The arrogance to that is staggering, but that's pretty much universal. And again, people can't do it. So they can't. They're unable to even conceptualize how arrogant they are and how bad they are at thinking, because it's not that they're stupid. They lack the tools. They're using tools that are. It would be like playing baseball with people where they were either wearing glasses that were distorting their vision terribly, or they just had bad vision. And if everyone kind of had not so good long distance vision, but you had glasses that compensated for it, then it's not like exactly that you're better or worse at baseball, that they're terrible athletes, but they, functionally speaking, would be terrible at baseball if they couldn't see well at all long distance, and you could because you had glasses. It's not exactly that you're a better athlete, right? It's not that we're exactly smarter than other people at all, but they just lack the tools. They're not peers. They're just in the Stone Ages, and they just can't do anything like what we can do when it comes to thinking. And I don't just mean about God. I mean about all sorts of day-to-day things that are critically important. On the other hand, there's things like there's plenty of stuff in life where people can outperform us intellectually because this type of error, this lacking of tools, doesn't affect that activity that they're doing. And there's plenty of that in the world too. So be careful. Don't just think you can trade stocks better than someone else or whatever just because you understand this stuff. You can very likely perform better in like relationships and do all sorts of things better, but not necessarily that or lots of other things. All right. So here. So as we kind of grasp this terrible double meaning kind of problem, then we could, what happened with me was I started to get a sense of how it had to be. And so my kind of intermediate stage in my philosophical journey was where I thought, all right, well, clearly there's some sort of mind that is attached to us, each of us, that's individual. And I'll explain why this is. I'm just going to assert this, but I was like, there's some sort of mind. There's some sort of and then there's some sort of external reality that that's shared between other people, right? Like again, if I punch someone in the face, that doesn't only affect me. Like there's another person that's affecting, right? So, or of course, if I hug them or do something nice. So clearly, in every way, whether I move a cup from left to right or pass the salt or do something little or extreme or whatever, obviously there's a shared thing that's going on. And so whether it's a physical reality or at least a code, right? And what I would say is I would call it code. There's an external code at least, right? I'm trying to step back to what we can know, right? This is how we accomplish any goal or figure anything out, is we, instead of just trying to directly grab what we want or race to what we want, we can always try that first, but if it's not working, then we start to accumulate what we can know. So with realizing with naive realism, representational realism and such, that like perceptualism wasn't right and that our mind couldn't just create reality in a relevant way, because clearly there's a shared aspect to reality. But I don't know the nature of external reality, because if all I'm ever seeing is my consciousness screen, if all I'm ever seeing is a representation of it, then I literally don't know it, right? If we have no direct observation of the external world, right? We have a representational interaction with the external world. We experience something on our consciousness screen, or we have experience a visual image, and when we talk about just vision, right? But if all we ever have is representations, then we don't know what the external world is. So let's step back and stop making assumptions about it. And so if I refer to it as at least code of whatever that means, that word is referring to something actually without assumptions. I'm not stipulating it's code. I'm not assuming it's code. I'm building the meaning of that. By code, I mean something a little bit metaphorical to, like, computer code or any other kind of code, Morse code. But something where I'm not assuming it has qualities other than that there's some sort of shared information pool or whatever, like again, code that we're all interacting with in some way, right? Or at least other people are interacting with, and I affect them, they affect me. That couldn't happen if there wasn't some external reality, at least some kind of code that we were all interfacing with. And at the same time, if there was only code and we had no individual interface like mind or self or body or whatever it might be, again, I'm kind of telling you my intermediate step, but this was right in and of the sense of to the extent that I was just going back to bare bones of some things I could know. And then I was able to build a little bit more from there to what we have on this slide. But I don't now. I wish I maybe had a slide for this intermediate step. Well, actually, let me just do that. So basically external code and then individual interface and then a being like us. Okay, so this is again like kind of intermediate, but true in its own way. So if there was no code, external code, then there would be no connection between you and anyone else. So if you thought you were punching someone in the face, there's no other person that's experienced that in any way. It's not affecting anyone else. That is, obviously we can't live like that for a moment, and it's dangerous and counterproductive, and again, it's totally antithetical to everything. So obviously there's an external code, and if someone feels like it's not obvious, they could just work on it some more, right? But most certainly you couldn't live that way for a second. So that's your first clue. All right. Then if we say, all right, well, so that's what if there's no code? That means there is, because if we say what if there isn't, and it's totally absurd, then it must be. So same thing with an individual interface, like some sort of mind. Okay? Now I'm not, again, I try not to project additional qualities. I'm using the word mind in that case, although individual interface isn't using the word mind, so it kind of helps in not importing meaning. It's easy to accidentally like import meaning when you're trying to build a concept at its kind of bare bones level. So, and bare bones is good in the sense that it just contains what has to be and not importing like other qualities that we kind of think, right? Like the idea that the of like brain and how it works, if we kind of instantly import that, then we might be importing some assumptions or something. However, something about our brain certainly seems connected, right? It's pretty obviously connected to mind and interface. But one way or the other, there's some sort of interface, because if there wasn't, let's look at the opposite. What if there was no interface? Then we would have to either be aware of nothing, or we'd be aware of like the whole external code as it is, fully and immediately and comprehensively. Does that make sense? Like there's no way to be aware of just part of the external code, or some sort of oh no, I didn't say being. It was actually code, interface, and image. There, and then ultimately there would be some kind of being aware of the image, but I meant image. Okay, so there we go, image. So there has to be an interface, because clearly our image that we clearly we get not just even awareness of part of the code, but we're not even aware of the code itself, right? Again, we're not aware of the external world directly itself. Naive realism makes us feel like we are, but then when we reflect on that for a bit, it can't be the case. So we're not aware of code and or the external world. And to the extent that we think we are aware of it, it's false, right? It's a kind of conceptualization of the world being hard and full of stuff and matter and energy and all that. Matter and energy work as a metaphor extremely well, but we're going to come to understand that they don't exist kind of self-existently in the way that we think that they do. And they don't exist. The nature of them is much more like I've referred to in a computer game, or a story like Lord of the Rings, where Middle Earth exists in a certain way. Computer game is better because it's kind of dynamic and so forth. The code for the game exists. There's obviously a code if you're playing a game. If you're playing a multiplayer game, there's obviously a code that you're accessing, right? That's both the code for the game and the code for what's, I mentioned this before, the state of the game right now. And then you obviously need your own avatar or character, right? You can't play a game without your own character, because you don't just like jack into the code and just see all the code, plus all the code for what's right now and all the code that kind of underlies the game, right? Kind of like the physical laws and the what's going on right now, the configuration of things right now, right, in a game. So the game metaphor really helps to see what we're talking about. There's obviously code, and then there's obviously a character we have to make, or some sort of interface with the game, right? And because the opposite would be nonsense. And the opposite specifically would mean we would either be aware of none of the code or all of it as it is. So, but since we're aware of a partial representation that's based on the code, in other words, like what's on our screen, right, on a computer game, there's a representation of like what we see, right? If we see a character running around in a little world, right, in the game world, then that's a representation, that's an image. We have to have the character so that we see the image that we see rather than some other image. Because there's no such thing as like putting all the code on the screen, right? There's an image that has to go on the screen. And the nature of that image is basically there's a self and there's a world around the self. There's an environment, and you're interacting with the environment with yourself, see, right? And so, but like if you're a little character and you're in a forest, if someone said, well, why can't the trees or why can't the goblins in the forest be real, and why can't they really be shooting at you? Like why can't it be real? Why can't the goblins be the ones making it all happen, and the trees and the universe, right? If someone asks asking why the universe can't do this or that or create us or create the world is really akin to asking why the Easter Bunny couldn't create the world, or Gandalf from Lord of the Rings, or Superman. It's not at all their nature. Just like the world that you imagine that exists within the computer game world, right? That you're running around in with the trees and the goblins and the surface, like you're walking on something, right? Like dirt or a path. Like let's say your character gets wet and there's like a a condition that your character has for 30 seconds where it says like in the upper left of the screen, your character's wet. He now takes 50% more damage from electricity. Right? We could say, well, why wasn't that wetness of my character caused by the actual wetness of the water? Right? Like there's no wetness of the water or actual water within the game, but there is conceptually, right? There it is. We can see a river inside the game. We can see that our character went in it. We could maybe see them kind of dripping or represented as wet, but there's no actual water. It wasn't, none of that's caused by real water, right? It's caused by the underlying code for the water, code and the code for the character and so forth, right? And that's how real reality is too. I'm not trying to just assert that. You can just keep thinking it through, because the opposite of it is absurd. If you, in real life, if you go in water like a lake or a pool or something and you get wet, then there's no actual body that's made wet by actual water. There's code for the water, there's code for your body, and it appears wet in your consciousness screen, and the code, the configuration of things is such that it's wet, and that is relevant for all sorts of things. Like it's the configuration of how things are, as if it was a computer game. So if your real body goes into a real pool, as we think of it normally in life, and it really gets wet, it's all like code, right? There's no actual water, actual wetness. There's a perception of it all. There's an image of it all in your consciousness screen, and there's a real code for it, both underlying the reality of the world and then the configuration of how things are configured. And it really matters for the next moment. And the metaphor that you actually have a body that's actually covered with, that has water and is wet, works. But it's a metaphor, just like imagining there's really water inside the computer game world that really made a real character wet. That works within the game, but it's just a metaphor. It never actually, there's no actual water within the game in the way that we think of it. Okay, so to go to this slide here, because if we get this, we pretty much understand a lot of God, especially if we understand the idea of goodness. It can be helpful a little bit to understand the nature of infinite, and how that can work, or how it doesn't, how there's meanings of infinite that don't exist. But anyway, but this is the main issue. It's also pretty cool just to understand how existence actually works, and realizing this, what we're talking about here on this slide, this will enable you to have it be possible for you to have meanings of your words that don't move, that are not inherently blurry. And everyone else in the world that does not understand this, literally all the meanings of their words are blurry, and they can't undo it. They can't make them not blurry. All their little attempts at doing so, and their attempts to like have rigorous definitions or defining this or that, they're all blurry. They're defining words with words. Just trying to be careful to use the right blurry words to define some other blurry word isn't gonna help you, right? It's like pulling yourself up from your own bootstraps. So people just can't do it. So any aspect of life or task in life where that's relevant, they're not going to be able to do very well compared to you. They're going to be like crippled. Of course, don't mean to be anti-crippled. Being crippled is not wrong, right? But it's unhelpful relative to what you're crippled with to do that task, right? Okay, so what's existence composed of? Existence, so we start with what? Consciousness screen. Whenever we try to understand anything, it's rooted in consciousness screen, because that's all you're aware of. You're literally aware of nothing else. You cannot be aware of anything else. So the foundation for any of your knowledge always has to be rooted in your consciousness screen. So your consciousness screen exists. You're directly aware of that. There might be all sorts of questions you might ask about your consciousness screen that you can't answer. Like if you're looking at your lawn or a lawn, or a place where there's a bunch of grass, you can't answer how many blades of grass there are, but you're still aware of something as your consciousness screen, and you're aware of something to do with the grass if you're looking at it, even if you don't know every blade. Because the opposite of being aware of your consciousness screen would be being aware of nothing, which is not the case. Okay, so you have consciousness screen. Then because there's a consciousness screen, there's something aware of that consciousness screen, and that's you. Again, be careful not to import any other qualities yet. We can discover other qualities that you might have, but we're building the definition of you. And for starters, it just means that you are aware of your consciousness screen, which means you have the capacity to be aware of consciousness screens, right? And since you can experience variable value in your consciousness screen, then there's this goodness and badness, and that leads to a sense of purpose of where everything's going to be revolve around having more goodness, at least the attempt to. Now, interface and code actually ended up, what I would run into is this interesting thing where your interface, your mind, still has to be kind of blended in some way with the external code. Right, if you go back to this slide, your individual interface and external code are weirdly part of a some kind of whole. They kind of have to have something about the same nature to them, right? And if we think about a computer game, once again, and I did not discover any of this through analogy. You can't discover through analogy. You can explore, ask some questions, or think. Like you can initiate thinking through an analogy, and you explaining by analogy is great because someone who's explaining by analogy ideally understands the analogy and the thing they're explaining and can talk about the similarities and differences, but it gives like a point of comparison to explain something. But you don't discover by analogy because you don't know the difference between analogy and the analogy and the thing you're trying to discover, right? An analogy is similar to what you're trying to think about, but also different. By the way, that relates to our representation of the world, right? People normally think that they can discover about the world through their analogy, which is their representation of the world. But you don't know where your representation is different than the underlying external code or underlying reality. And so therefore, we can't reliably discover about the external world only through analogy. We can certainly do the scientific process where we say like, well, I think this will be the case in the future. I think this will repeat, right? And that can enable us to develop computers, the internet, smartphones, right? And fire, right? And nuclear energy and all kinds of stuff, combustion engine, et cetera, et cetera. That's nice. But again, there's an inherent danger, or you're automatically going to be wrong sometimes when you try to discover based on analogy. But you can certainly use analogy as like a springboard or a place to ask questions. And nothing I'm saying says that science or the scientific method does not work for what it's good for. Of course, it works well for what it's good for, and it's exactly the right method for when it applies. But anyway, I did not discover what I'm showing you via looking at a computer game and saying, oh, that's how reality works. No, I had questions, and the computer game is mostly a way for me to explain to other people. And it may have given me some clues as well. The existence of them and knowing about them might have given me some clues to like brainstorm and try things. But the way that I derived this was through a process that I've described and that I mostly in my method video in the Law of Implication Explained series, but through opposites and so forth, looking at the opposite of something, just like I'm talking about as I'm doing naturally here. So I was saying that individual interface and external code needed to sort of blend together. There had to be something where they kind of were part of the same thing, even though they were also different. And if we look at a computer game, as I started to say, your character in a computer game is coded for within the game, right? The baseline code, which codes for the ability to have characters and the nature of characters and how they can be created and all that. And then there's the configuration of things, right? There's the code for the configuration of things that are currently the case in the game when you're playing it right now. But they still are part of the same world in a certain sense. Your computer character and the computer world kind of blend together. right? And you can't really say necessarily exactly where one ends or one leaves off or whatever. Or it could be that actually interface is a subset. It's a part. You have like there's an individual part of the external world that applies just to you and is responsible somehow, or partly responsible, plays a critical role in why you see the image that you're seeing. I could say the experience that you're experiencing, but whenever I talk about image and visual, I'm using it as a simplification, right? A useful simplification. So you see what you're seeing because of something, and that something is your individual interface. But the interface is actually a subset of the whole external code, or kind of a part that's attached to you somehow. So that's reasons. So there's the consciousness screen, which I kind of put first, and then there's beings. That's you. And there's other people, which is relevant for understanding the nature of what's going on in the world with goodness and why the world's not perfect and all that. Or it's not perfect in in a certain sense. It's perfect in a different sense. So then, now this was a major breakthrough, and this was hard to realize because it's so different than how we normally think. So we normally think that the universe is made of matter and energy, and matter and energy is a very useful and correct way of representing or having a metaphor of how the universe works, or how the external code kind of, how it's going to be, how things are going to progress, and so forth. However, fundamentally, the universe is not made of matter and energy. Matter and energy are like derived in essence. They're contingent. They're like a metaphor even. They're literally, I'm being literally literal here. I'm not using literally in the wrong sense, right? People often use literally to mean figurative, the word literally to mean the opposite of literally. But your mind and the external world, and your mind's actually part of the external world. So your mind is actually a subset of the universe. Or a subset of there might be more to there might be like a greater universe that we might think of as supernatural, that more than just of what we think of as a natural world, right? But it would still be actually of the same nature. Any supernatural world, like let's say angels existed, or you had a mind that transcended your brain, right? So it wasn't physical in the way that we think of it. That you obviously do have a brain, but then there's also, let's say there's also a mind that the only way you could have any continued existence after death, I think there has to be, or else the world would already be perfect, would be if there's some mind that's not only tied to your physical body, right? But if angels existed, which I'm not saying they do or don't, and certainly if a mind exists apart, in addition to your brain, then that's still code for the external world. It's just not atoms and molecules. It's just addition to that, right? There would be more laws and more supernature, right, so to speak, than just nature. But all of that is understandable within this scheme. Very simple, really very simple. It's simple just in the basic sense of it's still external world if there's supernatural stuff as well as natural. It's still, they would just be within one conceptual idea. They're still made of reasons. So angels would be made of reasons. A mind that's non-physical would still be made of reasons, is what I'm saying. So matter and energy and anything supernatural as well. I'm excluding God when I say supernatural. Obviously, people normally think of as God as part of what's supernatural. God is a separate issue. So anything supernatural apart from God, and then anything like we think of as part of the natural world, plus, and then your brain and your interface and so forth, they're all made of reasons. So matter and energy, for example, are literally made of reasons, right? There's like string theory that they're made of strings and so forth. That may be the case, but then those strings would be made of reasons. So the fundamental, in one sense, a unified theory, but there's still a different type of unified theory that is not the type of thinking that I know about and I'm good at with mathematics and deep physics and other maybe other mathematical or physical sciences. Mathematical is not a physical science, but the combination of them, quantum physics and so forth. I know a little bit about those things, but I'm not an expert. And there may be people that are way more talented than myself, not just that have knowledge, but that also have a greater talent for figuring that stuff out. And it's very useful, right? Nothing about what I'm explaining about would help someone make a cell phone. It might help better organize people to create a cell phone or cure cancer, right? I think a lot of the bottlenecks to curing cancer are probably philosophical, like just disorganization and discord with people and government regulations that comes from philosophical mistakes, right? Things like that. So, but still, there's still like a scientific and type of process and thinking that other people have great talents at and not me. And nothing about what I'm talking about is going to directly do that, although it might clear up bottlenecks that get in the way of some of that stuff. I don't think I'm smart in every way by any stretch of the imagination, so that I'm talented in every mental way, or obviously not every physical way. Just in, I think I'm pretty obviously talented in this one kind of philosophical or way, conceptual way. But not that relevant, but whatever. Sometimes knowing your own talents has some relevance, though, of course, and what to focus on and invest in life and so forth. Okay. So now we get underneath where we neither believe in naive realism nor representational realism. We don't see a representation. We experience a consciousness screen that the reason for the specific pixels in our consciousness screen I'm using pixels metaphorically, right? Again, we see more than just visual. I mean, we experience more than just visual, but I use visual as a simplification that works. So the exact configuration of the pixels right now in your consciousness screen are determined by reasons that kind of come from two basic areas. So God will be the one that can make consciousness screens. And I'm not defining God different than someone else's definition. I'm constructing what I mean by God from scratch based in consciousness screen. So our consciousness screen exists. That's basic. That's our foundation. It's undeniable once you understand what I'm saying. And you can't not understand it. You can't even misunderstand it once you do understand what I'm referring to. So God is capable of, and actually does, make consciousness screens. I will in a moment or a few moments get to why one God. Okay, because that might be a question people, well, what about, whatever, some question related to, why does there have to be one thing that's making all consciousness screens at every moment? But I will get to that in a moment, but at least for now, I'll assert or just say, so you have it as a reference. God is, I'm deriving that this must exist, and also I'm of course then saying God, which is very reasonable. So a thing must exist that is capable of creating consciousness screens. That thing that's capable of creating consciousness screens needs to understand consciousness, which can only be done if you're conscious, right? So God is conscious, does things on purpose, so intentional, conscious, is aware of everyone's consciousness screen at every moment, and literally actually creates their consciousness screen. And the configuration, as I was saying, of your consciousness screen is determined by God. God doesn't operate randomly or chaotically or on whims. So there have to be reasons why your consciousness screen is exactly the way it is and not some other way at every moment. And so God has those reasons. God can't just, I feel like this, I feel like that. God doesn't have some external source of whims. Like you and I are used to having whims, W-H-I-M-S, right? Whims, where external to us, like we think of our mind, I mentioned this fallacy last time, we think of our mind as us, but obviously our mind is not us, and obviously our mind is coming up with stuff. Now, ultimately God's doing it, right? But as I describe all this, then I'll be able to be more clear and specific about what I mean by mind. In order to talk, I need to use words that already exist and concepts already exist. So I'll say that, I'll use that now, or with an asterisk. Okay, our mind is puts impulses, right? Feelings like we want this, we want that, or it just puts ideas and stuff in our awareness. None of this contradicts the fact that God's doing all of it. I'm just trying to describe some things here. So, or none of it will, as we are now, what I'm saying. But our mind, or God plus our mind, put stuff, right? And including that we are aware of something. Some things feel important, and it's just some things are on our screen, and some things we're just not aware of at the moment. We can't even think about them yet because they're not immediately in our mind, right? So in essence, we have whims, right? We have this stuff just put in our screen, and that's limited, and makes us feel like doing this or that. And it kind of is a certain type of reason why kind of we do stuff. Again, I'm going to iron all this out. I just need to talk for a moment with the words that exist and concepts that exist. I'm just trying to describe this thing about whims. So God can't have whims. God doesn't have some external source that's just putting in God's mind a few things that is then the only thing that God can, think of. And, oh, I wanted to, so God literally has to have a reason for doing everything. That's not something that limits God. It's just inherent to not having whims. So if you think through, normally people anthropomorphize God, kind of like everything. Remember how I said, we start with where we're at, with how things are for us by default. And then we try to adjust. So when people think about God, they import all sorts of assumptions based on their experience of reality and being us, being a non-God being. And then they'll try to imagine maybe a little bit about God, but they're still importing all kinds of invisible assumptions. And one of the assumptions that people are constantly importing about God is that God can have whims. They don't say it in that way, but it's implicit within their understanding of God, is that God can just randomly kind of have an impulse towards something and do it. No, there has to be an actual reason why God does everything. And so the reason why your conscious field is the way it is there's an external code for a world. There's made up of reasons, and that is your mind, basically, like your interface, which also stores things that you decided and did previously in some way, in a kind of flawed but real way, right? That's habits, right, and so forth are based on that. But the one way or the other, between your mind and the external world, that provides the reasons why you're aware of what you're aware of. And everything can only be this way. And as you think about this, it doesn't have these contradictions that exist in the normal way that people look at the world. Now we can build the meanings of concepts based on this understanding of reality. Like, we can address the idea of what's a tree, and have the ability to do so. And I understand someone could be asking, well, David, what is a tree? But it's there's might be a bit of a distraction now. It's there's not just one thing, but then we can tease apart different things, and we can say well, are we referring to something we're aware of in our consciousness field? Are we referring to something in code? Well, what exists about trees in code, right? Well, lots of stuff exists about trees in code, right? Our mind, which is part of code, or the reasons, has an archetype of tree, right? It can, of course, we can have an experience based on a real individual tree, right? Where we look at it, touch it, and so forth. Of course, when we have that experience and when we do what we call touching it, we can understand that we're interacting with code, just like if it were jacked into a virtual reality thing and we're interacting with a tree inside of a virtual reality setup, right? We could, if it was done with enough tactile stuff somehow, we could feel like we're touching the tree. We could feel like we're looking at the tree. We'd understand, wow, this is pretty cool. It feels so real, but we know we're interacting with code, right? And so when we ask what is the tree, we would also be asking, well, on like kind of what context we're talking about. And the context might be obvious. If you're playing a computer game with some other people and you're sitting in the same room playing, and you're like, whoa, watch out for the goblin leader, right? He has a big sword, right? Or whatever. Then we know what level we're talking about. I don't need to explain in a deep philosophical way, I'm referring to the code within the game, and the image on your screen, right? You don't need that. But it's good to be able to conceptualize all that stuff and tease things apart when it's relevant and necessary. When we think this way, we don't have silly thoughts. I don't mean to be condescending or whatever, but like understandable, normal questions like, well, it depends, or objections like, well, it depends how you define God. No, it does not depend how you define God. That misses the point in all sorts of ways. Of course, all thought depends on being consistent with your meanings, right? I said that in the first webinar on the God's existence, I think, right? Logic is being consistent, right? Here, logic, keeping the meanings is my first slide of your words perfectly consistent. So obviously you need to do that, right? So if someone were to say, well, what you're referring to with the word God is changing, you're equivocating, you're not keeping your meanings consistent. That's a great objection. It's a very relevant objection. But saying it depends how you define God is just saying something kind of trite, like the sky is blue or it should be, right? Well, of course I need to keep it consistent. And of course I need to construct meanings of words that need to be constructed. If I were to construct a nonsense concept that inherently was contradictory and I were to call that God, then of course I couldn't prove that God exists because I would have be referring to a nonsense concept. So of course I would need to construct a meaning of that attached to the word, the symbol, the word God, that was coherent, that did exist, in order to prove it. If I define the word five, F-I-V-E, right, the numeral, the number 5, and something like a married bachelor instead of like 5 ones, right, instead of 5 units or whatever, like the correct or the usual definition. If I just said, well, there's a guy and he's married and he's a bachelor, meaning non-married, right, and his name's 5, right, then of course I can't prove that 5 exists. I can actually prove 5 doesn't exist, right, because it's inherently contradictory. So if someone was teaching someone about 5, they say, well, it depends how you define 5. Well, sure, right. If I say use your mind or think about this, someone can say, well, it depends how you define thing. Well, yeah. How about using the definition that's going to get you ahead, right? That's going to work. Okay. So that was that got through what I wanted to describe here. I think I will just about be done, except for I have some time for discussion. And then we'll continue with yet another webinar where we can wrap up some things about infinite goodness, just kind of make sure we particularly tie off loose ends. I thought we might be tying off loose ends here, but actually I needed to kind of comprehensively explain this concept because I did an overview before and I laid some groundwork as well before, but then I think we needed to talk about this. Also, again, I'm aware that people watching may have a good background on this from me, or you may have discovered it, but part of this is going over it in a way that kind of reminds us, gets it particularly clear, and helps us describe to other people, or even just give them a link right to it. So it's exciting that obviously I'm making this to be publicly available on YouTube and then wherever else. I have to look into Truth Social and so forth. Great. Okay. I didn't really leave a lot of room for discussion, but there's currently not a lot. Let me see here. Mahai says, if we have peers that we perceive are not being happy, it will make our mind have a goal. What it would do was it would make it seem normal to not be happy. For example, suppose all of your peers are happy in one sense, but they're unhappy in relationships. They feel like the opposite sex is toxic, or that people are toxic, and that relationships aren't worth it. And your parents are like peers, typically, in many cases, to your mind in terms of relationships, right? For you, for your own marriage, right? It was the main marriage that you got to observe, right, as you're formulating your psyche and mind. So if your parents weren't happy in their relationship, then it's gonna affect a feeling of normalcy. Of course, you can have experiences or revelations in life. I don't mean a supernatural revelation, but just kind of, there could be, the peer thing is complex. So you could somehow have your standards and norms changed through some sort of maybe movies that you watched and you love what you saw, or other people you knew, or just some theory that you had that you really liked, some vision of relationships. But I think I can answer your question by saying, like, if we have peers that we perceive, it will make our mind have it. It's not like it has the goal not to be happy, but there's a standard that kind of where relationships aren't done in a very happy way, and then your goals, it's you have to kind of look for it, like kind of think it through, like someone could have a goal for justice where, like, look, if someone wrongs me, I need to communicate that to them and show them and teach them by making them feel it, by basically punishing them back. And if you have that standard or norm, right, if that's how normal people act, if that's how the world should be, right, basically if you can make a should statement about how something should be, like they shouldn't get away with this, that's a statement that reflects your standards and norms, right? Well, I can't just let them get away with that. I can't just let that go or pass, right? So if you can have standards and norms like that kind of underlie the happiness or the unhappiness, and then that will then you'll have goals, like to get back at the person you're with, rather than, and maybe they didn't wrong you at all, by the way, right? A lot of times we're wronged in relationships is where we kind of feel like they owe us something, or there's something that they agreed to as part of being in a relationship with us. And then we did this for them, so they should do this for us. They should. See, that's like a standards, and that comes from a standards and norm. And then if we additionally have a sense we should, punish them or make them feel it, back, then the result would be unhappiness. People don't, in one sense, you're right. Like people don't, or you're, kind of like referring to something correct. People don't typically have a goal like overtly to be unhappy. Maybe some might, but I think they're trying to be a little bit clever or funny when they do so, right? Again, you can't really live consistently with trying to be unhappy. I agree that people can make a pretty good approximation of that in some ways, but if you really examine what they're doing, they're just kind of playing word games, or they have an inherent blurriness in their thinking where they can think both that they want to be happy and unhappy at the same time, or that it makes them happier, gives them a sense of satisfaction or something, right? To be unhappy or project being unhappy and that sort of thing. Just for clarification, I know I didn't finish all that, but just for clarification, is electromagnetism and wavelengths and gravity reasons themselves, or something that's not reasons based on reasons? Electromagnetism and wavelengths and gravity are, in one sense, metaphors, or like as we think of them, we think of the representation of them. Okay, that the representation that we think of is based on an underlying reality that is a regularity in how things work, like how God does things for this universe. So when we think about them, we're thinking of a representation the representation is representing some underlying reality that exists as a regularity in how God does things. It's like written in the physical code of the universe, so to speak. It's kind of how God coded things, but God can't code things and just have them run themselves. In essence, if God codes something, God still has to run the code, right? Humans can code something into a computer and then the computer runs it, but God has to like run the computer as well as coding it. It's not really relevant. Like someone could ask, well, can God like make an angel or a robot or a computer to do it for God? Basically, yes and no. I mean, in essence, it's not that God can't do that, but there's no difference between God doing that and God just doing it God's self. Like they boil down to the same thing anyway, if you think it through. So are they reasons? Yeah, they're reasons. Like once God codes them, they're reasons how God has to, there have to be regularities in the physical world as part of us having free will. Because if we theoretically had free will, like to seek understanding, it wouldn't be relevant if we couldn't affect external code, the real world, right? Physical reality. We can't affect anything if everything's chaos. There has to be regularities that can be projected, that our mind can kind of lay out for us in order for us to, practically speaking, have any free will. Like you can't love, if you look at what has to happen for us to love means you're basically spending resources to make somebody else better off, right? Like for their consciousness, for the value of their conscious experience to be better net, ideally. You don't know for sure, right? You have limited knowledge, but it's reasonable. It's a situation where it's reasonable for you to think that if you were to spend resources that you could otherwise spend on yourself to basically help somebody else, to put it simply, then that's the only way that you can basically express love. Or you couldn't love it without the capacity to do that, which means you have to be able to have resources. You have to be able to have some sense that resources affect other people, really. That takes physical laws. So if you trace all what has to happen for this, what has to happen for that, it's kind of cool and interesting, right? It's a little bit like what I was going to wrap up with next time too, as I say, talk about goodness, love. All of this is not like foo-foo abstract stuff when I'm talking about it. It's all fits together in a way that all makes sense. Like my scheme of existence makes sense in a way that people have no real sense of possibility of normally. They normally think that there are all these impossible questions or things that are hard to answer. There's plenty of stuff I don't know. There are questions I don't know the answer to, but there's a lot of stuff that I do know that all fits together very, very coherently and clearly and necessarily, that I do know and that you can know and that you may know already from either me or your own discovery. That's stuff that people think, is, up for debate or just kind of internally would be debated, and people come up with their own answers, but who knows? But that's not the case. And so it's really interesting to kind of see the sequence of logic of how free will and what's necessary for it and why, right? The capacity to love enables for more is more. It enables for abundance, which is how the universe is made, how the world that we're in is made, is to it's all geared up so that we can love other people, and in doing so experience more goodness than we could just experience on our own through just pure pleasure. That again necessitates resources. That's why violating someone else's resources, violating someone else's property is so tragic, because you're literally attacking their ability to love other people, to express love, to functionally love other people if you take their resources, right? When the government takes resources to care for the poor, what happens is, separate even from the economic waste that realistically occurs with that, it takes the love out of the whole equation. So it strips all the love out. So to some degree, if you steal or extort or tax some rich guy or some not so rich person, some single mom still pay lots of taxes, right? But you tax one person in order to care for the poor. The problem is there's no love there when the government does it. You strip the ability for the person that's being taxed to lovingly give those resources. And someone might say, well, what if they don't? Well, what if the government doesn't? I mean, like again, what you're doing is you're generally increasing the inefficiency anyway. You're reducing the efficiency just in terms of actually getting people fed or cared for. But separate from reducing the efficiency, you're definitely stripping the love or the capacity to love out of the equation. And that's where the real tragedy and horror is of government trying to take care of people or help poverty or anything of that nature. It strips the very basic reason for existence out. And so it's very evil. Even as people think they're being kind, like George Bush, right? I favor Republicans, but just for an example, just to show that it happens so pervasively, including it with Republicans for sure, you'd be like, well, the measure of a society is like how it cares for its most vulnerable members. That sounds good, but what is society? Well, it's government, right? Maybe he meant both, right? But he also meant government because you're talking in the context, of government. So even the relatively good guys, so to speak, you're going to get these terrible things where they anthropomorphize a nation, which you can't have a war without anthropomorphizing a nation. Like you kind of think of a nation as one person who wronged this other person, right? Like Japan hurt America or attacked America. Therefore, we bombed Tokyo to show them or to get them to surrender. But wait, actually, when you look at it in terms of individuals, doesn't bombing Tokyo, which I don't even mean the nuclear bomb now, they actually just conventionally bombed Tokyo, the US Air Force. But doesn't that mean like dropping bombs on like little children and blowing them up and burning them alive? Well, yes. And that's just dead wrong in every case, in every way, and everywhere. But it all gets blurred out when we just think of it and we anthropomorphize a country, right? It makes us feel more powerful. It makes us feel like there's a solution, that we can get justice, that we can do something, right? We feel helpless. If there's a bunch of individual Japanese people, and I'm talking about World War II, that bombed ships in Pearl Harbor, it's hard to get back at those people. We don't know who they are, right? It's hard to get justice. It's hard to feel strong. It's hard to not feel helpless. But the minute we feel like Japan's a person and we're a person, now we can hurt them. We can bomb their children. And it's it's all based on a philosophical mistake. And then you have real people suffering right this minute in Ukraine and so forth, and in Russia. Lauren said, this was a tough one for me. Lots to work through in regards to reasons. Yeah, well, good. I mean, if it's tough, that means we're at the bottleneck that you need to deal with, right? Which is great. The stuff I talked about is correct and crucially important. And the ripple effects on all sorts of practical benefits to your life are massive. So great that we're dealing with the thing that you have to deal with. I think I'm pretty happy with how this webinar unfolded. Of course, that's pretty subjective, but I think it's then this could be a great one to rewatch. I think I described things in a way that again I'm pretty satisfied with. I don't think I garbled it too badly, relatively speaking. Do I think that someone else with a real talent for explaining things and making it visually great with slides and editing and more, maybe even with how they act energetically as a person, I think there could be someone way more talented than me in that area, and I would love to have them, see them do this in a way that I'd be like, oh wow, that's just awesome. I would never have done that. I'm not nearly talented enough in that area to do that. So I'm not claiming to be that, but anyway, for me, I'm kind of happy with the webinar in the sense that I think it's worth rewatching if there's any, if you're still working on this. Dave said, at the point that all of the problems are basically solved or mostly solved, like in the world, by dissolving contradictions, I think Dave means, and the standards and norms are way higher, and not just higher, more accurate. It's not that I want people to have higher standards. In some cases, people can have lower standards, right? For what, in terms of like what satisfies them or whatever. But anyway, but as long as higher means more accurate, more, because what we want is to have, so goals, and I might have said some of this before, but just as it's relevant to this question, goals, when our mind perceives that we further a goal, like it gets closer, right? In a sense, we're going to feel a sense of pleasure or something akin to pleasure. There might be different, things that trigger pleasure or joy or happiness or whatever, but we're going to experience something nice. probably all pleasure is some form of our mind giving us different types of senses of emotional or physical good feelings at the in it related to feeling like we're furthering a goal, right? Even when we eat food, right? And so kind of basic survival things that might have obviously gotten tainted where we're not eating food that's best for health, but still our mind thinks it is, right? So since our immediate feelings of goodness are going to be based on our mind perceiving that we furthered a goal, then two general things are going to help us experience more net goodness over the course of our existence. One is aligning our goals themselves with that which is going to be, healthful, like gonna basically it's coherent, where a goal now doesn't conflict with a goal later, either from someone else or for ourselves, right? So having a coherence or an alignment, a non-contradiction, right? Aligning our vectors, which is not just subjective, right? There's an objective nature to aligning vectors, where, like with goals, where some goals are just inherently more healthful, using health as not just a physical health, but healthful both because of the specific configuration of the physical laws in nature and because of affecting other people. Right? Like a goal to get justice is inherently not going to be aligned with what's going to be most good overall, essentially, for example. So we want goals to be aligned, and contradictions in our thought, our mind about understanding of reality, and both practically day to day and kind of deeply, so that goals are aligned with what's good long term and short term. Well, short term is kind of, again, it's related to what our mind perceives if we're getting closer to goal, no matter whether it's good or bad for long term. So we want it all to be aligned. Secondly, we want our mind's sense of progress to be aligned with actual progress. There's aligning of goals and there's aligning of our mind's sense of progress. And of course, as I say all the time, and that's kind of our fundamental idea, is that the more the mind understands understanding and then equates that with progress, right? If the mind doesn't understand understanding, if it has a twist in its understanding of understanding, then simply aligning understanding with progress is not enough, because if you align a flawed concept of understanding with progress, that's not ideal. You want to have a correct understanding of understanding in your mind, and then for that to be aligned with progress, and then for goals themselves to be aligned with what's healthful for the future. I didn't even finish what Dave said. Okay, so basically solved, and the standards and norms are way higher than even our typical point of comprehension. Does it really matter who solved what? Absolutely, beautiful, beautiful thought. Absolutely right. It does not matter. I would love for other people to solve stuff, right? As I say, I'm happy to sip margaritas by the pool, have other people figure stuff out and explain stuff. Or would we basically just enjoy the fruits of it? Yeah, we would just enjoy the fruits of it, right? We used to think, and we want to be the one to have the patent or invent something, or keep it from other people so we can make money. If problems were solved, then careers would be organized in a way where careers would be open, and we could apply for a job and get it, and we could just work at a job and enjoy it, and it would be in accordance with what we kind of liked and our talents, right? And that sort of thing, right? Until then, there's always opportunity to make money by organizing other people in a way that they kind of are making product, having as I say, traffic, sales, conversion, and product, and in a way that they kind of enjoy the experience of working in that business. So you can either make money by organizing things, or if things are organized great, there's all kinds of just great businesses around, and you could just use your talents as you want to, or that already might exist for some people. I couldn't find it for myself, but lots of people can find that. Then great, you just go do that and make your money and be fine, and avoid money sinks, money traps, like bad ideas about money where you just kind of need more and more money past what actually will be helpful, and you have to just figure that out for yourself. Greed is more of a symptom. It's not a cause, right? Or it's not, a root reason. It's more, just like I say, fear is based on kind of a miscalculation, like a wrong type of fear, like a bad type of fear would be based on a miscalculation of cost benefit regarding a particular action and the cost of it. Similarly, greed would be just a miscalculation of the amount of money that you can use to increase goodness for yourself and others. And then someone could say, well, isn't that infinite? Well, depends on what you have to trade for that money, right? So then, right, so you're balancing what you have to, what you as an individual would trade for the money, which is different for other individuals. Some people can be just very nice for them to earn millions or even billions. For other people, that might not be so possible or nice, and so their money, it would just be a different total balance. Mahai, is there a reason from God why the conscious being me uses free will sometimes? Yeah, I want to get to free will, but we'll have to probably finish that off next time. I can show you a slide. The binary on or off nature of our free will, our power, which is kind of one and the same. But it's kind of cool to realize that free will is actually the same as our power. And power is actually our power to make more goodness for ourselves and therefore and for others and therefore ourselves, as it reflects, as we care about them. So your power is actually, again, literally your power to have more goodness. More, yeah, good. So it has to be on or off binary, because let's say you had the power to do 4 different things. You could jump, you could, move your hand, whatever. Like if you had a power to do a bunch of different things and they were all directly within your power, then the problem is you'd have to decide how and when to do those things. Or if you had the power to do one thing, but it was still a lot of how and when and so forth, then your real power would have to be the ability to figure out what we first supposed that our power was, to if we had the power to do a whole bunch of things. Then again, we couldn't directly do those. We have to figure out when or which of those things to do. Or if we had choices, we had a multiple choice at every moment, A, B, C, D, or E, right? Then our real power would have to lie in figuring out whether to pick A, B, C, D, or E in each case, right? Like if at any moment you could choose 5 different answers. So we would think, oh, that's a lot of power. Compared to just choosing one answer or not, you get to choose between 5. Maybe that would make you more powerful. But there's no such thing. It's logically impossible for you to have the power to choose A, B, C, D, or E directly. By extension, by a series of ripple effects, yeah, you have the power to do all sorts of stuff, obviously, right? You can feed yourself and tie your shoelaces and do your work and stuff. But that's a ripple effect. But you can't directly, I'm talking about you have power that literally no one can stop. You're literally unstoppable and all powerful in some way, some root way, just regarding a specific subset of something. But you have something that you can do that no one can stop and that God won't stop. Since you have it, God's not stopping, right? If you had no power whatsoever, everything would be meaningless. It would be just cruel for you to ever experience anything bad, cruel from God, and so forth. So that's not the case. So you have power. Again, you can't live consistently with the idea that you have no power whatsoever, not even to think about anything or whatever. You can't live consistently with that for a second. Again, it fails the punch in the face test. So you have power, but it's something rather than nothing. But it can't be A, B, C, D, or E or anything like that, because then your power would lie in figuring out whether it's A, B, C, D, or E. But then you can't be something that changes. You can't be something that like processes information. And so as you think it through, it boils down to the power has to be whether you simply do rather than not do. And so if you do, then you'll be setting in motion a ripple effect that leads to more goodness. And then people want to say, well, how do I see directly, or they'll say something that logically equivalent to this. It's a totally natural question. I'm not in any way being condescending or derogatory towards it, but they'll say, well, how do I see it? And I don't think you can see it directly, which is confusing because like, well, how do I know it's on or how do I do it? But maybe by understanding it, which is like, well, you remember, you don't understand something by seeing. you understand something actually by seeing that the opposite is false. If you see, you're seeing an image, right? You're seeing the only thing that you see that's not an image of something is your consciousness screen itself. You don't see an image of your consciousness screen, you see your consciousness screen, right? That's the root, that's the exception, and you need that exception. Everything can't be something you can't understand. There is something you can understand, something about your consciousness screen. But I don't have an even better answer of how you can tell that your free will is on rather than off. But I think the very nature of seeking to understand it and care about goodness, there's like the more you seem to be actively caring about what's good and important, understanding what's good and important, the better. And so you can be immersed in a specific topic during the day where you're not thinking like philosophically or deeply, but if there's a red flag, oh, I know, I know, I have a pretty good summary of how to know is never, you're sort of, this is kind of profound actually, you're sort of constantly confronted with this question. Just agree that bad is good. And you should disagree with it. And the way that this is hidden and slid past you is necessary. So doing something that you know is hurtful to yourself or someone else might feel necessary. And I don't mean don't do it or not. What I'm saying is don't be satisfied that something that involves a partly bad outcome for someone else's conscious experience or yourselves is sufficient. You might still do it because you just don't see any other option right then. But even as you're doing it, you like have a red flag where I want to understand this better. It's not good enough. I'm not going to agree that this is the best that can be done, that this is necessary. Right? Like, you know, right now Ukraine's being invaded. There's things that might seem necessary to do to the Russian boys that are fighting. And I don't see an alternative. And I am pro-Ukraine. I want Ukraine to stop the invasion and to be free and rebuild and so forth. But ultimately, I want to understand something even better somehow, or get underneath it, or have this dissolve at some point. You know, some people will say like, well, we don't like taxes, but taxes are necessary. Well, again, necessary means the best option, which is good. It's a good choice relative to whatever else. So it's basically saying it's good, right? So, but you don't want to be satisfied with that. Whenever something that is bad, or even might be bad, is presented as good, the fundamental lie, the fundamental mistake is agreeing that bad is good. And it's so normal to think that bad is good because it's not put in those terms. And so trying to discover the various ways this is hidden and slip past us, and the various ways we rubber stamp it, and we might not, like in the moment, we can't figure everything out, right? Seeking doesn't mean you instantly get the answer. It doesn't mean you didn't seek, or that you're not seeking because you don't immediately know the answer, obviously. So just because you don't know how to solve the problem that's in the specific instance of bad is good, and just because you don't immediately figure out the good, the truly good response or action to take or thought to have, doesn't mean you're not seeking. You're seeking if you stop agreeing that bad is good. So fundamentally, your power is not rubber stamping the idea that bad is good. And that means trying to seek the different ways that it gets past you, that it's sugar-coated. And so that's a pretty profound endpoint. Great question that got me to say that. I think I'll end it here, even though I always kind of have to cut things off when there's still more questions. But But awesome. I'm really glad to have ended on that note. And thank you so much for your participation. Thanks, Mahai, very much. Thanks, Dave, very much. Thanks, Lawrence and Eric. And oh, and Julie got to be on again. Wonderful. And Mike for letting people know again about the webinar and for being on it and participating, and everyone. So, and Brandon, of course, and everyone else. So thank you so much, and I will see you soon. I probably will just keep going next week and not having a delay. I do think that probably next time we'll wrap things up. Didn't know if it was the first one, the second one, third one. I guess this will be the fourth one next time, and then that should wrap things up. But of course, that's not my main goal. It's to stick with that. My main thing is to be sufficiently comprehensive, which is still a judgment call. But if I have any sense that it's not sufficiently comprehensive, then I'll probably keep going. And so we'll find out next week. Take care, everybody. Appreciate everyone. You're very welcome. Very welcome, guys. I'll have this one repeat for a while. Excellent. Excellent. Love it. Take care, guys.